Hello and welcome to In Depth. I'm Teena Jha. On the show today, we talk about the elections in Israel. After a supercharged and intense election campaign, Israelis went to polls on Tuesday to choose their next government. Most of the world is focused on whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has led the country for the past decade, will be able to hold on to power, or whether Israelis have enough faith in his rival, former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, to make a big change in the country. Officially, elections in Israel take place every 4 years. But this time, Netanyahu chose to dissolve the Knesset nearly a year early on 24th December and called a snap election for 9th April. This year's elections are also important as the outcome could have a major impact on Israel's future, its role in the region, and its relationship with the United States and American Jews. We discuss all these issues in depth today. Israel on Tuesday voted to decide whether to extend Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's long right-wing tenure despite corruption allegations, or to replace him with an ex-military chief, Benny Gantz, who is new to politics.
This year's election in Israel has been the most closely fought general election in years. Benjamin Netanyahu has tried to battle for political survival after more than a decade in power. Netanyahu's campaign was hobbled by serious corruption charges. Compounding the fact was that his main challenger, Benny Gantz, is a former chief of staff of the Israeli military. Further, Gantz was leading the Blue and White Party in alliance with the Yair Lapid, a former finance minister and TV personality. His challenge to Netanyahu was on the key issue of security and cleaner politics.
We all should respect democracy. We all should take responsibility.
It's very exciting to participate in an election that has more choices than an ice cream shop.
I think it's a very critical election. My views are liberal. I want the government to reduce its involvement in our life. I want the taxes to go down.
14 main parties competed for 120 seats in the Knesset or Israeli parliament. No party has ever won a majority in Israel's 120-seat parliament, the Knesset, and the country has always had coalition governments. Voters in Israel cast their ballots for a party, not a candidate. The more seats it obtains in the Knesset, as the government is based on a nationwide proportional representation system. That means the Prime Minister is not always the person whose party wins the most votes, but the person who manages to bring together enough parties to control at least 61 of the 120 seats in the Knesset. Political parties have to pass an electoral threshold of 3.25% to gain a Knesset seat. To be asked to form a coalition, candidates need the support of a majority of Knesset members, or at least 61 lawmakers.
Well, it's a multi-party democracy, and you have Knesset, which is their parliament, has around 120 odd seats. So you have multi-party system based on proportional representation, and in that system, more often than not, I think, in fact, never has any single party won an absolute majority. So you always have coalition governments, and one of the things with the kind of multi-party fractures that they have is that coalitions from either the right or the left have tended to form governments over the last decades, and the idea of insecurity, of course, is at the heart of the political discourse, because, as you point out, it's a very dangerous environment, dangerous neighborhood, and at times political parties tend to capture that sense of insecurity in their articulation, both on national security as well as on foreign policy.
In a bid to boost the right wing, Netanyahu had urged two far-right parties to form an alliance and invited an even more extreme faction, Otzma Yehuda, to join them. Netanyahu described the partnership, which was widely condemned, even from within his own support base, as a technical move to ensure he would be able to form a coalition if re-elected.
There has been a mix. Sometimes national security becomes very important because, of course, as you know, Israel is very vulnerable, and at times the situation within Israel gets escalated. The conflict between Arabs and Jews get escalated. At times there are threats from the neighborhood, so national security becomes a priority. At other times, when the situation is a bit more peaceful, you have economic issues that tend to dominate. In these elections, it seems to me that Mr. Netanyahu, who is campaigning on national security primarily, is seemingly doing very well, and I think he's helped in that by the fact that in Israeli economy is doing very well. So I think that makes Israelis relatively more comfortable with their economic situation.
On the other hand, Gantz had signalled that he would make territorial concessions toward the Palestinians, but has also sidestepped the question of Palestinian statehood. In the run-up to the election, Blue and White has a lot of its support from the middle class. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
6.3 million Israeli voters took part in the election to choose their next prime minister. Let's now look at key issues in the elections in Israel, some of which include security, corruption, and the economy. The run-up to Israel elections saw a hotly contested campaign over several issues. The most important were security, corruption, and economy. But the one dominating factor in these elections was the personality of Benjamin Netanyahu, seeking a record fifth term. The elections are seen as a referendum on the 69-year-old leader, whose towering personality has been marred by corruption charges. His defenders listed his numerous achievements, including security, preventing the Syrian civil war from spilling over into its borders, deterring Hezbollah from launching a new war against Israel. Netanyahu also tried to portray himself as a statesman, building diplomatic ties with US President Donald Trump, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro in the run-up to the vote. But his detractors questioned his leadership, calling his politics divisive and alienation of Israel's Arab minority. The multiple corruption charges facing the Israeli Prime Minister have also been fodder to his opponents.
I think Mr. Netanyahu is one such example. His Likud party is a right-wing party, which is quite hawkish on national security issues. And he has been helped in the process, especially in the last 2-3 years, by Mr. Trump, who has been very, very friendly to Israel. And he has, in fact, very recently, by making the case for Golan Heights and other, shifting the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. I think all of these very controversial decisions that America seems to be, the Trump administration seems to be making in favor of Israel, has boosted Mr. Netanyahu's credibility and popularity in Israel.
In February 2019, Israel's Attorney General recommended indicting Netanyahu with bribery, fraud, and breach of trust charges in a series of corruption scandals. At least 3 former close confidants turned state's witnesses and testified against him. The most damaging case involves an influence peddling scandal in which Netanyahu was accused of promoting regulation worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel's Bezek telecom company. In return, Bezek's popular news site Walla allegedly provided favorable coverage of Netanyahu and his family. The police say there's evidence that he accepted nearly $300,000 in bribes over 10 years. He's also accused of making deals with the publisher of Yediot Aharonot, a leading newspaper, to garner favorable coverage. According to pre-poll surveys, the top concern for voters is security, with no resolution in sight to tensions in the Gaza Strip. Since 30th March 2018, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been protesting along Israel's separation fence, demanding an end to the siege. Since the start of demonstrations, Israelis have killed 266 Palestinians and over 30,000 have been wounded. While many Israelis support use of firepower against Palestinians, Netanyahu has been criticized repeatedly for not responding forcefully to rocket attacks. Gantz Blue and White Party became a serious challenger on the security issue as it roped in 3 former chiefs of the Israeli army.
So I think a lot depends for a lot of Jews in Israel. It is about who can protect them the best, who can give them a sense of security, who can give them a sense of reassurance that the world is with them. And that has sort of been a powerful force in Israeli political consciousness.
In the final days of the campaigning, Netanyahu has chosen to push the issue of annexation of the West Bank. He said he would apply Israeli sovereignty to the settlements. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. We'll take a short break on the program. On the other side, we'll talk about the 2 prominent candidates in the elections in Israel. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching In Depth. In our next report, we take a look at the political career of Benjamin Netanyahu and his key political opponent and former army chief Benny Gantz. Newcomer Gantz, who formed his political party only 2 months before elections, emerged as the most serious rival to Netanyahu in the Israeli general election.
Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power since 2009, after a first stint as Prime Minister from 1996 to 1999. Born in Tel Aviv in 1949, Netanyahu's family moved in 1963 to the United States. At the age of 18, Netanyahu returned to Israel, where he spent 5 years in the army. After his military service ended, Netanyahu went back to the US, where he earned bachelor's and master's degree at the MIT. In 1982, he became Israel's Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington and was appointed Israel's permanent representative at the UN in New York in 1984. Netanyahu became involved in politics when he returned to Israel in 1988. He won a seat in the Knesset and was appointed the Deputy Foreign Minister. Netanyahu became the chairman of the Likud party in 1992 after the party lost the 1992 general elections. In 1996, he became Israel's first directly elected prime minister after an early election following the assassination of the Prime Minister of Israel. Netanyahu lost the office in 1999, defeated by the Labour Party. In 2001, Netanyahu returned to the government but resigned in 2005 in protest against Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Following the withdrawal of Ariel Sharon from the Likud, Netanyahu was once again elected as the party chairman. He was elected as Prime Minister for the second time in March 2009. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Netanyahu publicly accepted the concept of a demilitarized Palestinian state, but insisted the Palestinians accept Israel as a Jewish state. Netanyahu also took a hard line in foreign affairs, lobbying for the international community, particularly the United States, to take stronger action against Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program. Domestically, Netanyahu faced growing economic discontent among the middle class and the young.
The two frontrunners, Benjamin Netanyahu, the present Prime Minister, and Benny Gantz, who is leading the opposition Blue and White Alliance, are fighting to a large extent on the security platform. One of the reasons why Netanyahu is under threat, if you wish, in this election is that Gantz is the former chief of army staff, so he's considered on the military side, he's in a very strong position. But both of them, in many ways, have a very strong election security platform.
The government fell in 2012 following disagreements with coalition partners. In 2013, Netanyahu was elected once again as Prime Minister, and in 2014, he ordered a large-scale military operation in the Gaza Strip in response to rocket fire into Israel. Israel and Palestinian militants fought for 50 days before agreeing to a ceasefire. While Israel had the support of the United States during the conflict, relations between the two nations remained difficult over Iran's nuclear program. In the 2015 elections, Netanyahu returned as Prime Minister. However, his fourth term took place in the shadow of 4 ongoing investigations into bribery and other forms of corruption allegedly committed by Netanyahu and members of his inner circle. Ahead of the 2019 elections, Netanyahu had struck a chord with the voters with Israel's renewed relations with the United States. This includes US withdrawal from the international deal curbing Iran's nuclear program, Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the Israel's capital, the transfer of US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and a cutoff of US aid to the Palestinian Authority over its refusal to resume peace talks that collapsed in 2014. Netanyahu's rival is former Army Chief Benny Gantz in the polls. The 59-year-old retired Lieutenant General is a newcomer to the politics who formed the Kahol Lavan or the Blue and White Alliance in February, promising to unite a country that had lost its way. In the wake of the Netanyahu corruption cases, Gantz vowed a clean government and managed to gather support from the middle class over the issue.
So as I mentioned, security is important, and in this election, because Netanyahu, who is otherwise normally he's now running for a record 5th term as Israeli Prime Minister, he's had a corruption scandal in his government. So clean governance is now the second issue, if you wish. And one of the reasons why Gantz and he are neck and neck in the polls is simply that Gantz says, I am as strong as Netanyahu on security, but I am a cleaner person because I have no record of corruption. And that is effectively the two main issues that the two primary candidates are fighting over.
Gantz called for pursuing peace with the Palestinians while maintaining Israel's security interests. Gantz promised to make territorial concessions towards Palestinians, but has also sidestepped the question of Palestinian statehood. The son of Holocaust survivors, Gantz grew up in farming community and held a number of important positions in the Israel Defense Forces during his 38 years of service. He served as chief of the staff from 2011 to 2015. Gantz's Kahol Lavan party is running neck and neck against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud in the polls. Several exit polls indicated that Netanyahu was better placed than Gantz in the general elections. But the question was, would the Gantz party be able to muster enough seats to win the majority in parliament? Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And just weeks before the general elections in Israel, the United States of America recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Now, Golan Heights is a focus of global dispute ever since Israel seized it from Syria in the six-day 1967 Middle East War. Until now, the United States of America, like the rest of the world, had refrained from accepting Israel's claim to sovereignty over the strategically important Golan Heights. But just weeks ago, US President Donald Trump had tweeted saying it is time to extend that recognition, after which it's important to understand the strategic importance of the Golan Heights.
Recently, US President Donald Trump created a flutter with a tweet saying that it is time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Trump's message brought the Golan Heights once again into global headlines. These were part of Syria until 1967, when Israel captured most of the area in the Six-Day War, occupying it and annexing it in 1981. That unilateral annexation was not recognized internationally, and Syria demands the return of the territory. Syria tried to regain the heights in the 1973 Middle East War, but was thwarted. Israel and Syria signed an armistice in 1974, and the Golan had been relatively quiet since then. In 2000, Israel and Syria held their highest-level talks over a possible return of the Golan and a peace agreement. But the negotiations collapsed and the subsequent talks also failed. The Golan Heights, a rocky plateau in southwestern Syria, has a political and strategic significance which varies in size. The heights give Israel an excellent vantage point for monitoring Syrian movements. The topography provides a natural buffer against any military thrust from Syria. The area is also a key source of water for an arid region. Rainwater from the Golan's catchment feeds into the Jordan River. The area provides a third of Israel's water supply. The land is fertile and the volcanic soil is used to cultivate vineyards and the orchard and raise cattle. The Golan is also home to Israel's only ski resort. Israel says that the civil war in Syria demonstrates the need to keep the plateau as a buffer zone between Israeli towns and the instability in its neighbor. Israel's government says it also fears that Iran, an ally of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, is seeking to establish itself permanently on the Syrian side of the border in order to launch attacks on Israel. Syria wants to secure the return of the Golan Heights as part of any peace deal. In late 2003, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said he was ready to revive peace talks with Israel. During US-brokered peace talks in 1999-2000, then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak had offered to return most of the Golan to Syria. But the main sticking point during the 1999 talks is Syria seeking a full Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 border. This would give Damascus control of the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, Israel's main source of fresh water. Israel wishes to retain control of Galilee and says that the border is located a few hundred meters to the east of the shore. A deal with Syria would also involve dismantling Jewish settlements in the territory. The Golan Heights is not densely populated. According to some estimates, there are around 50,000 people, with Israeli Jewish settlers making up nearly half. The rest are mostly people of Syrian ancestry who are Druze, a religion that has been described as an offshoot of Ismaili Islam. Druze residents of the Golan Heights have largely resisted obtaining Israeli citizenship and have maintained a strong connection to the Syria for decades. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, so that's it from us in this edition of In Depth. You can also watch our program online on YouTube and Twitter. And don't forget to send your feedback and suggestions about our program. We'll be back same time tomorrow with a comprehensive view on some other subject. Thank you very much for your time.